Corpus Christi, Texas, that sparkling city by the sea, as they call it. It's a hidden gem on the Texas Gulf Coast, and it has these sun-soaked beaches and a vibrant city life. That's what you're sold, right? But is it the right place for you to call home? In this video, I'm going to tell you about it as someone who lived there for 6 years. One of the first things that you should probably consider about Corpus Christi that's good is the cost of living. Now, it's cheaper than living on either one of the coast, the East Coast or the West Coast. Definitely cheaper than Chicago. Maybe a little bit more affordable than places like Austin. While it is a little bit more expensive than some cities in Texas, Corpus Christi is less expensive than other places. Now, it tends to be a little bit lower than the national average, and that kind of works towards the appeal of Corpus Christi being a budget-friendly place to live, to work, and to raise a family. Keep that in mind. As far as outdoor recreation, Corpus Christi has a lot of it. I mean, literally miles of beaches and water sports, fishing, birding, if you're into birding. There's a lot of parks. Corpus Christi has a lot of parks. Some of them leave a lot to be desired. Some of them pretty good. It just depends, again, where you're at, what you're looking to do. Some of the more inner parks located off the waterfront, they need a little bit of work. They need a little loving care. Most of the attention goes to the areas where the tourists are going to hang out, the people who are just in town for a few days, which is good. You can go down to the waterfront. It's nice. It's beautiful, often crowded, but it can also make for a pretty nice place. So it just depends. Now, some of the neighborhood parks, even though there are nicer ones in the nicer neighborhoods, it's 50-50 wherever you go. But there's a lot of outdoor activities. You have the Laguna Madre there, which is beautiful. Smells, but that's pretty typical. There's nothing you can really do about that. You just have to kind of expect it, right? Especially during certain times of the year. But it's not horrible. It's something that you can deal with. If you're into fishing, it's a great place. The Laguna Madre, wonderful place to go fishing. A lot of, red drum, black drum, good fishing, really good fishing. Flounder is pretty good. It's not a bad place. And it's considered one of the birdiest cities in America, where there's a ton of migratory birds. If that's your thing, doing bird photography, wildlife photography, it's a pretty cool place to live in that aspect. So you definitely want to take a look at that. As far as the climate goes, it's obviously a subtropical climate, and it's pretty warm all year round. That allows for a lot of outdoor activities. You can get out and do things, right? You can enjoy life pretty much 365 days a year because you're not snowed in. In that aspect, Corpus is great. The weather, perfect. But I think that's kind of typical of most anywhere in South Texas. So does it really separate Corpus? I don't know. It just depends. But all in all, the weather's pretty nice. And that's something to really take into consideration. If cultural diversity is something that you're into, Corpus is probably not your place. Very rich Hispanic heritage, lively art scene that's kind of growing a little bit. It's a great place. It's colorful. But it's not going to offer you the same diversity as other cities. So if diversity is your thing, like, say, Asian cultures or Indian cultures, if these are your thing, yeah, you're going to be hard-pressed to find it in Corpus. Keep in mind, Corpus is a deeply Hispanic, and WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. It's where the mix comes, right? So just keep that in mind. This is kind of where the text meets the mex, right? But it's a very interesting place. And you have a lot of people moving in from other places who maybe aren't native Texans, or they're not native Texicans, right? And they're trying, like a lot of places, trying to bring their culture with them. That does add to the diversity, but it also adds somewhat to the problem. And sometimes you see those cultures clash, right? So there's this mindset shift there. But diversity is a real issue in Corpus Christi. You basically have two types: Hispanic and WASP. That's what you have. To some extent, it's a family-friendly atmosphere. Depending on the neighborhood that you're in, Corpus Christi is a pretty safe place to live. It's not horrible. It's not as bad as the Rio Grande Valley. It's certainly not as bad as some areas of San Antonio, but it can be. And that's something to keep in mind. Now, the schools, 50-50, okay? Depends on where you go. You have Flower Bluff. Flower Bluff is a pretty decent school district. If you stay out of the politics of it, you stay out of the good old boy system, it's not too bad. They have a pretty good way of doing things there. But is it the greatest? Absolutely not. It's certainly, but that being said, Corpus Christi schools, when it comes to education, are probably just representative of the larger political problem facing public education in Texas. And they get caught a lot in the firestorm of public versus private ed. And, that's a huge wrangling that's going on in the Texas legislature. So sometimes those political problems in places like Austin, they spill down to places like Corpus Christi. And you have to keep that in mind. And again, you have to remember this, even when it comes to education. And you hear me use this term a lot: WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, okay? It's huge. And the Hispanic culture is huge, okay? And again, sometimes these two theories certainly collide. That's very visible in the education system, extremely visible. And a lot of times you see the disparity, you see the separation of the two within the education system. And beyond the diversity within the education system, I'm not totally sure that they know how to handle diversity. So if you come from a diverse culture that's probably not closely aligned with the WASP or the Hispanic group, you may be in a little bit of a pickle when it comes to education. So there are some negative things to living in Corpus Christi, and I know this has been a little bit negative, but I think if you're considering Corpus Christi as your home, you have to look at the negatives. One of the main things that you have to look at is the limited job market. Okay, so while it is growing, the job market is certainly growing there, it's not as diverse as in larger cities. And you're going to hear me say that word a lot: diversity. Now, to a general Texan, to somebody who has the Texan mindset, diversity is perversity. Okay, it's not very well accepted within the state as a whole. Corpus Christi, very reflective of that, and keep that in mind. WASP versus Hispanic. This is what it is. The job market, when it comes to diversity, is just not there. You basically have your oil and gas, your industry, and you have a little bit of tourism industry, and that's largely it. There's just not a lot feeding this economy. And that can be good or bad, depending on how you look at it. somewhat quasi-tourist destination, you have to take that into mindset when you're living in Corpus. You can see a lot more traffic in certain places, like North Padre Island. You can see that. Port Aransas, you can see it during peak tourist season. Even a little bit on North Beach, you can see this kind of peak tourist traffic. And that's a potentially negative thing, depending, again, on how you look at it. You just need to expect it, that you're going to deal with a lot of traffic. Now, the hurricane risk. The hurricane risk, it is what you make of it, right? It's not something that happens every single day. It's a mitigated risk. It's something that you just learn to deal with. So do you focus on hurricanes? I don't think you make it a huge part of your day-to-day life, but you definitely keep it in the back of your mind and you prepare for it. And if you prepare for it and you treat it right, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. It's not something that should keep you awake at night or should even keep you from moving to Corpus Christi or anywhere on the coast for that matter. You just learn to mitigate the risk when it comes to hurricanes. Be prepared. It's not something that happens every day. Don't let it scare you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the humidity. The humidity can be rough for some people, and especially during the summer months. It can easily get up to anywhere between 100 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit with a feels like temperature of 100 to 125. So in Celsius, if you're talking anywhere between, 30 and, maybe 38, 40 degrees sometimes for a feels like temperature because of the humidity, it can get hot. If you're susceptible to the heat, this is definitely not your place. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. If you're okay with the heat and the humidity, then great. But we're going to come back to that here in just a minute. Like most of the state, Corpus Christi struggles with a limited public transportation system. They do have a bus system, and it's okay for the most part, but largely ineffective. It takes you forever to get anywhere. It's a very heavily car-dependent environment. So, again, keep that in mind. If you're a public transportation person, just plan that it's going to take you an hour or more to get somewhere. But then again, that's probably not any different than anywhere else in Texas because public transportation is just not seen as a priority. It's probably not going to be, and it probably shouldn't be, honestly, if I'm being totally honest with you, because Texas has a whole lot bigger fish to fry. They have a lot more problems than just dealing with public transportation. The idea of intercity connectivity, Corpus is kind of plagued by that. There's no real rail line. There are no rail lines that connect Corpus Christi. The airport is improving, but still has a long way to go. It's intercity connectivity can be a problem. It's just figure it's going to take you 2 hours to get almost anywhere or more, depending on how you get there. And with the way that the system is set up, as far as air goes, Corpus is not a hub airport for every reason in the world, and they're totally justifiable. Keep that in mind. You're going to have to connect to somewhere. And oftentimes, you have to weigh the balance. Is it cheaper to fly out of Corpus Christi, or is it cheaper for you to drive to San Antonio 2.5 hours away, maybe even to Houston? It's just all going to depend. But that's a consideration. Intercity connectivity is definitely, if you're someone who travels a lot, this may become an issue for you. I was talking about the heat, right? There's something else to be talked about. Allergies. Allergies are really something that you have to deal with if you live along the Texas coast. And due to its location, right, you often see high pollen counts, right? You often see people with allergy issues, especially during certain seasons. This is something that you have to, again, take into consideration, especially if you have children who are susceptible to allergies, or maybe you're an adult with allergies. Sometimes the humidity and the high pollen, all of that, it can really affect you. And then you have the pollution from the industry around there, which that's a whole nother ball of wax that we can argue about. I personally am a really horrible asthmatic. My asthma, since I've moved from Corpus Christi, has improved 110%, literally. I have a lot more good days than I have bad days. In Corpus Christi, I would have a lot of bad days when it comes to the asthma. So again, it's if you're susceptible to asthma or allergies, something like that, you have to keep in mind the industry does play a huge role in that. And clean air is definitely not a priority in Texas. Never has been, it never will be. And that's not unique to Corpus Christi. That's just a cultural thing within Texas. You have to keep in mind, industry comes first at all cost. And even if that includes bad air. Brain drain. Now, young professionals and recent graduates from the university, they tend to move away from Corpus Christi. And this is, again, not totally unique to Corpus Christi. It's a Texas thing, right? It's again, I've said this a lot. Corpus Christi is kind of representative of the larger cultural and social issues in Texas. And if you're not familiar with what brain drain is, it's basically where you get an education, you get a lot of knowledge, and then you leave and you take it somewhere else because there's a better opportunity somewhere else. Now, yeah, younger people tend to look for things like nightlife, quality of life, good place to raise a family, diversity. It's not necessarily Corpus Christi, and it's not necessarily a lot of places outside of the population triangle, the Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, back to Dallas triangle, where most of the people live in Texas. You can find a lot more diversity. You can find a lot more nightlife. You can find a lot more opportunity within that triangle. Now, keep in mind, Corpus Christi is 120 miles outside of that triangle. So you just have to keep that in mind. And most of the people that stay work in the industry, a little bit in healthcare, a little bit in tourism and commerce, but not a lot. Most of it is industry. So Corpus is an industrial town, so definitely keep this in mind. Road construction and traffic, just something you're going to have to deal with. Corpus Christi is plagued with bad roads. It's just what it is. And they're constantly trying to stay on top of it. They're constantly trying to fix it, but it seems like that there's a quality control or quality assurance thing there. As soon as they fix one, it washes out again. If there's a big rainstorm, there's going to be more potholes pop up. It is what it is. You just have to learn to deal with that. The traffic, the road construction, it's everywhere. Corpus Christi is a city that was neglected for a lot of years. Political leaders, social leaders, they neglected Corpus Christi for a long time. The infrastructure fails. It was poorly built, poorly maintained. It was this machismo political mentality that's still very prevalent today within the group. And the local power brokers tend to focus more on what's better for themselves and not what's better for the greater good. That's why they run for public office in these small to mid-sized cities. But keep in mind, with that mentality comes a neglect. A neglect for the good things and neglect for the big things and neglect for the important things like roads. And sometimes with that neglect comes carelessness. And you just have to expect that even though it was neglected, they're trying to fix it. And for better or worse, that comes with its own set of problems. It's important to note that with all the negatives, there's some positives. And, like I said, some of the positives, they're there, right? It's an affordable cost of living for the most part. beautiful beaches. You have a warm climate year round if that's your thing. You have a very unique culture with the blend of the Hispanic and the WASP culture. And then it's a somewhat family friendly environment. Is it as diverse? Probably not. Is it as welcoming and friendly? It just depends. Corpus Christi is a place that's an example of the larger social problems in Texas.